On the 10th of October in the year 732, in the next 48 hours, the Western civilization will either survive or cease to exist. There will be no churches, no cathedrals, no Renaissance, and no Enlightenment. Everything you recognize as the European culture is about to be erased. And standing between existence and oblivion, a warlord with no legal claim to power is commanding exhausted farmers against the most lethal military force on the planet. I know you will be wondering what am I talking about, but let me tell you what they don't teach you in school. The Battle of Tours wasn't some glorious clash of civilizations. It was a slaughterhouse, a desperate, muddy, and horrifying bloodbath where men fought until their arms physically couldn't lift swords anymore. In less than a century, the Muslim armies has conquered 3 continents. They had annihilated the Persian Empire, a superpower that had existed for 1,000 years. They all vanish within 4 years. They also ripped half of the Byzantine Empire away from Constantinople. They had crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and consumed the entire Iberian Peninsula within 36 months. The kingdoms that has stood for centuries all deleted from existence faster than most military campaigns even begin. Now they are in France, and there is nothing left to stop them. But this is where things start to get wicked. There was one man with a single decision and 1 week of pure calculated violence that would echo for 13 centuries. This is the story of how a bastard with no crown became the most important person in European history. I know you are going to be wondering why I just called him a bastard, because you really need to hear what actually happened. Because the truth is so much darker and much more insane than the legend. Let me show you how fast an empire can die. In 711, the Visigoth kingdom controls all of Iberia, ancient, powerful, and protected by the Pyrenees Mountains, a natural fortress that had kept invaders out for centuries. But in 714, the Visigoth kingdom did not exist anymore. That's 3 years to erase a civilization. Here's how it happened. 7,000 Muslim soldiers crossed from North Africa into Gibraltar. They faced a Visigoth army 5 times their size. It should have been a massacre. Instead, the Visigoth king died in the first engagement and his army disintegrated while the nobles fled, and all the cities surrendered without fighting. By the time Europe realized what was happening, it was already over. The Umayyad Caliphate, the empire you might never heard of that controlled more territory than Rome, at its peak, now ruled from Arabia to the Atlantic Ocean. And they had no intention of stopping because they have developed military tactics that wouldn't be matched for centuries. They have light cavalry that could travel 80 miles in a day. Also composite bows that could punch through armor at distances European weapons cannot reach. Psychological warfare that turned sieges into surrenders before the fighting even started. And they had momentum. Every victory brought new recruits. Every conquest brought new wealth, weapons, and new intelligence about their enemy territories.
If you want to hear more stories like this, battles where strategy defeated strength, where the impossible became real, where one decision changed the course of nations, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter of history.
By the 720s, the Muslim raiding parties were hitting targets deep in Francia, modern France. These is not scouting missions. It was a full military expeditions. They are burning monasteries, enslaving populations, also testing defenses, probing for weakness. And in 732, they found it. Duke Odo of Aquitaine, the ruler of southern Francia, met a Muslim army in open battle near Bordeaux. His forces were crushed so completely that survivors couldn't even describe what happened. All they just remembered was endless cavalry hitting too hard. Odo barely escaped with his life. The Muslim commander Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the governor of Al-Andalus, pressed his advantage. He drove north with somewhere between 20,000 and 25,000 soldiers. The exact number is lost. But what matters is they were professional killers at the peak of military evolution. Between them and the complete conquest of Francia stood literally nothing. Now this is when the bastard I mentioned earlier was born. Charles Martel wasn't supposed to exist at all. His father, Pepin of Herstal, was the mayor of the palace, the real power behind the Frankish throne. But Charles was an illegitimate son, born to a concubine, with no inheritance and no future. When Pepin died, Charles's stepmother seized power and had Charles thrown into prison. He should have died there and be forgotten. But he escaped and raised an army from literally nothing. He fought a civil war against his own family and he won. Then he fought the Frisians, also the Saxons, and then rebellious Frankish nobles. By 732, he has been fighting non-stop for 15 years with no official title except mayor of the palace, basically chief bureaucrat. The Frankish kings were puppets. Everyone knew Charles held the real power, but nobody could challenge him because he was the only person who could win battles. And now Duke Odo, his political rival, the man who'd spent years trying to undermine Charles's authority, came crawling north, begging for help. Charles could have said no. He could have let Odo's territories burn and consolidated power while his enemies destroyed each other. But he didn't. Not because he was noble. It was because Charles understood something about Abd al-Rahman that nobody else did. He wasn't going to stop. This wasn't a raid. It was the beginning of total conquest. So Charles called up every fighting man in northern Francia, farmers, craftsmen, and minor nobles. Literally anyone who could hold a weapon. He promised them nothing except the chance to keep their lands. He gathered maybe 15,000 to 20,000 men, almost all infantry. Heavy infantry wearing chainmail that cost more than a house, carrying shields that weighed 30 pounds, armed with spears and swords designed for formation fighting. To be honest, all they have is slow, defensive, and completely unsuited for fighting cavalry. So Abd al-Rahman's scouts reported back that the Franks has already assembled an army, but it was a defensive force with no mobility and no ranged capability. Once the Muslim cavalry got around the flanks, it would be Bordeaux all over again. The governor prepared to annihilate them. He had no idea he was about to meet the hammer. The armies met along the old Roman road between Tours and Poitiers in mid-October, and then nothing happened for 7 days. Within that 7 days, it was meant for psychological torture. The Muslim cavalry riding close to the Frankish lines, showing off their speed, their numbers, shooting arrows to test the range, screaming insults, just trying to provoke a charge, but unfortunately for them, the Franks didn't move. Charles had chosen his position with surgical precision, hills behind him, nowhere to retreat. The only approach was straight up a gentle slope directly into his formation. So, on the 8th day, Abd al-Rahman made his decision. Dawn broke cold and gray. So the Muslim cavalry formed up in waves, thousands of mounted warriors, their armor gleaming, lances ready. The ground would shake when they charged. That was all what they have been thinking. Then they charged. Unfortunately, the Franks stopped them. Their shields was locked and spears was braced at 45-degree angles. The Muslim warriors died crushed, impaled, and broken. But the men behind them stepped forward and filled the gaps. The cavalry withdrew and reformed, then charged again, and they keep getting same result. This goes on for several hours. The Frankish soldiers were terrified. They were dying. But they held because Charles Martel walked behind their lines where every man could see him. He was silent and unmoved, watching his anvil endure. By afternoon, Abd al-Rahman had a problem. All his cavalry was spent, while horses are exhausted, and the riders already injured. The Frankish line was weakening, but it wasn't breaking, and every failed charge cost him men he couldn't replace. So he committed his infantry. He sent them forward to engage the Frankish line, directly giving the order to grind them down. The fighting became more intimate, brutal, men wrestling in mud, stabbing with daggers, because there wasn't room to swing swords or axes. Charles saw his line buckling, so he did something insane. So he sent Duke Odo, the man who had been humiliated at Bordeaux, on a cavalry mission around the battle with orders to attack the Muslim camp. Odo's tiny cavalry force disappeared around the flanks while the main battle raged. They were invisible, and the Muslims did not even realize their camp is about to go down. They struck the Muslim camp like a lightning bolt. The camp where they kept all the supplies, where the plunder from months of raiding sat in carts, where the entire purpose of the campaign wealth, slaves, treasure, was guarded by a skeleton garrison. The garrison fought desperately, but they sent a messenger sprinting to Abd al-Rahman with news that would doom the entire Muslim army. The camp is under attack. Think about what this meant. The Muslim soldiers had been fighting all day for that plunder, for the wealth that justified this entire campaign. And now it was burning. Panic rippled through the ranks like poison. And the Muslim soldiers broke formation, not out of cowardice, but it was out of desperation to protect what they'd fought for. Abd al-Rahman tried to restore order, tried to pivot his forces. He tried to save both the battle and the baggage. The Franks surged forward. No longer defensive, Charles committed everything. His men crashed into the Muslim force that was fracturing, disorganized, because they are already caught between two disasters. And in this chaos, arrows flying, men are screaming, dust and blood turning the air brown, Abd al-Rahman rode among his troops trying to rally them. But a projectile struck him in the head. The sources don't agree what really killed him. Maybe it might be arrow, javelin, or even Francisca throwing axe. Well, I guess it doesn't really matter. The governor of Al-Andalus, commander of the most powerful military force in Europe, fell from his horse. And now he's dead. And his men kept fighting. For hours, most of them didn't know their commander had fallen. They pushed back against the Frankish assault and nearly broke through to the camp. At this point, the battle could still have gone either way. As sunset approached, Charles made a calculation. His men were spent. If they charge one more time, they might get killed. So the best option for them is to withdraw and reform, so they could finish the battle tomorrow. So he ordered his armies to pull back to the camp, and they are all expecting to resume the slaughter at dawn. But dawn revealed something nobody expected. The Muslim camp stood empty. During the night, while the Franks slept, believing victory was waiting in the morning, unfortunately, the entire Umayyad army had vanished. They had slipped away under darkness, all gone with no traces. They left everything, all of the supplies, plunder, and tents, everything that would slow their retreat south. When Abd al-Rahman died, the Muslim command structure collapsed. With no clear successor and no hope of victory, the surviving officers made the only rational decision: retreat while they still could. By the time Charles realized what happened, they had too much of a head start to pursue, and his men were too exhausted to chase after them. So Charles didn't. He stood on that battlefield surrounded by thousands of corpses, the Muslim and Frankish alike, and claimed victory. The Christian chroniclers would later write that Tours saved Christianity itself, that Charles Martel stopped the Islamic conquest of Europe, that this was the most important battle in Western history. What do you think about the chroniclers? Were they right? Yes and no, drop your thought in the comments. The Umayyad Caliphate remained in Iberia for another 700 years. Muslim raids into Francia continued for decades. Al-Andalus became one of the most advanced civilizations in medieval Europe. While Christian Europe stumbled through the Dark Ages, Muslim scholars in Cordoba were preserving Greek philosophy, advancing mathematics, performing surgery. Tours didn't end Islamic power in Europe. It ended Islamic expansion into northern Europe. But that was enough. Enough to secure Charles's power absolutely. His family, the Carolingians, would rule Francia for generations. His grandson would become Charlemagne, Emperor of the Romans, creator of the Holy Roman Empire. Every European royal house traces its legitimacy back through Charlemagne, back through Charles Martel, back through this battle.
The conquest sweep of maps are redrawn in the wake of history, an epic force reshaping the world.